Next, following our Vue.js.org read-through, let's take a look at the class and style bindings, shall we? A common need for data binding is manipulating an elements class list and its inline styles. Since they are both attributes, we can use vbind to handle them. We only need to calculate a final string with our expressions. However, meddling with string concatenation is annoying and error-prone. For this reason, Vue provides special enhancements when vbind is used with class and style. In addition to styles, the expressions can also evaluate to objects or arrays. And we're going to see this now. Binding HTML classes, binding to objects. We can pass an object to a bound class, short for vbind class, to dynamically toggle classes. We have a div with a dynamic class which is bound to an object. This object has a key active and the value with a value is active. The above syntax means the presence of the active class will be determined by the truthiness of the data property is active. So if this is true, this div will have a class of active. If it is false or falsy, this div will not have this class. You can have multiple classes toggled by having more fields in the object. In addition, the class directive can also coexist with the plain class attribute. So given the following state with ref is active true and then has error false, and the following template div class static and then vbind class active and text danger, it will render class static active because is active is true, so is the active class will be there, but has error is false, so the text danger won't be there. It will only have the static and the active. And the static is just a regular class attribute without any reactivity. When is active or has error changes, the class list will be updated out accordingly. For example, if has error becomes true, the class list will become static active text danger. The bound object doesn't have to be inline. Like this. It doesn't have to be inline, means inside the element. It can be a reactive property or a reactive object, name class object, and it can be used like this with class object inside the bound class attribute. This will render the same result. We can also bind to a computed property that returns an object. This is a common and powerful pattern. We have a reference is active equals true and a ref error which is null, and then we have a class object which is a computed property which returns an object. Okay, that's very nice. Returns an object which is constructed from refs. The active is gonna be this, and the text danger is gonna be this, whatever. And then we can use this computed property as a class. This is indeed very powerful because we can define our classes in JavaScript kind of easily and dependent on whatever they need to depend in a single object. I like this pattern. It's interesting. I like this thing. So a class as computed proper. I'm gonna make a small note. Maybe I should do the notes in the screen I'm sharing, but hey, I don't take so many notes. Binding to arrays. We can bind class to an array to apply a list of classes. Yeah, so these are just refs with string values, and then we can add them as a string like this. And this class will be active and text danger, which will render as expected these two classes. If you would like to also toggle a class in the list conditionally, you can do it with a ternary expression. So we have the array, and then we have the is active. If it is active, show active class. If else, don't add any class. So an empty string and then add the error class. So if isActive is true, we'll have the same classes as here. If isActive is false, we'll only have text danger. This will always apply error class, but active class will only be applied when isActive is true. Sure. However, this can be a bit verbose if you have multiple conditional classes. That's why it's also possible to use the object syntax inside array syntax. Like this. I'm gonna copy this thing, add it to my notes. My notes look very simple, like if you are wondering, just this bunch of notes to remember things I find interesting. This nested kind of array object inside the array syntax, that's interesting. Okay. With components. This section assumes knowledge of components. Feel free to skip it and come back later. When you use the class attribute on a component with a single root element, those classes will be added to the component root element and merge with any existing class already on it. For example, if we have a component named myComponent with the following template, paragraph with a classes foo and bar, then add some classes when using it, myComponent class bas boo. The rendered HTML will be p class foo bar bas boo, because the component has in the root element has the foo and bar, and then when we use the component we also add in addition the classes bas and foo, and this thing is telling us if we do this with components which have one single root, because components can have multiple roots in Vue 3. But if my component has one single root and we add classes to it, they will be appended to the list of classes the root already has. The same is true for class bindings. My component class active is active. If it is active is truthy, the render HTML will be foo bar active. Okay, so far so good, nothing strange here. If your component has multiple root elements, you would need to define which element will receive this class. You can do this using the $@ component property. So this is my component, and inside the component, instead of having one single root, we have two roots. These two elements, each of them is a root. Whatever they are, doesn't matter too much. And then in my component, when we use it, if we add a class bus to this component, bus or whatever, then if the component has two different roots, two or more, how should it know where to add this class to what root? For this, we need to explicitly tell the component to add them here using this syntax, $addrs.class. This syntax. So I'm gonna make a little. This is something new in Vue 3, because in Vue 2, component could never have more than one root, like used to happen in React. I'm not sure what's the state of React now, but in Vue now, you can have multiple roots. And this thing will render the class bus in the paragraph, as you can see. Cool. You can learn more about component attribute inheritance in fall-through attributes. Binding inline styles. Binding to objects. Style supports binding to JavaScript object values. It corresponds to an HTML element's style property. What is this? It's worth checking what it is. Styles are something from CSS, right? Style equal element dot style. Let's see some example. Let's read through this quickly. The style read only property returns the inline style of an element in the form of a CSS style declaration object that contains a list of all styles properties for that element with values assigned for the attributes that are defined in the elements inline style attribute. So element.style will return the inline elements for that element. The inline styles for that element, sorry. And this CSS style declaration is an object that is the CSS declaration block and exposes style information. Unfortunately, MSN docs are not always great at showing examples and showing clearly what's going on, but if I understand correctly, that essentially means so we're binding some styles here with this column property as an object, and the style names are color and font size, and I think what it refers is, notice that this font size if we were in CSS, it would be written like this, font size. That would be CSS, and then it would be like 1 rem or whatever it is. This is different than this font size, which is like camel cased. I think this is what it means here. We need to refer to the style property names in the camel cased version, not in the dashed version. Also, camel case keys are recommended. Style also supports kebab case CSS property keys. Oh, yeah, corresponds to how they are used in actual CSS. For example, this. Yeah, well, notice that here we have to wrap it in a string in single quotes. Yeah, so we can use them either like that, in camel case, or like kebab case, but wrapped in single quotes. Otherwise, yeah, there's some conflict with JavaScript keys, how they are parsed. Basically, you cannot use kebab case as a key in JavaScript directly, I think, in a JavaScript object. That's why you need this thing. It is often a good idea to bind to a style object directly so that the template is cleaner. So we have a style object which is reactive, which has color and font size properties, and then the style is bound to this object. The same as we saw before with classes. Again, object style binding is often used in conjunction with computed properties that return objects. The same thing we saw before, the pattern of building a class object as computed property, like this is a computed property, and then we use this class object directly in our template. The same can be applied to styles, inline styles. Binding to arrays. We can bind style to an array of multiple style objects. These objects will be merged and applied to the same element. Autoprefixing. When you use a CSS property that requires a vendor prefix in style, Vue will automatically add that appropriate prefix. Vue does this by checking at runtime to see which style properties are supported in the current browser. If the browser doesn't support a particular property, then various prefix variants will be tested to try to find one that is supported. This is honestly pretty amazing, because then that means that we don't have to think about the vendor prefixes. That's very good. Autoprefixing. When you use a CSS property, wait, yeah, I just read that thing. Multiple values. You can provide an array of multiple prefixed values to a single property. For example, display. So we are binding an object to a style, to an inline style, which contains a key display. And this display key contains an array with strings. WebKit box, MS Flexbox, flex. Okay. This will only render the last value in the array which the browser supports. In this example, it will render displays flex from 4 browsers that support the unprefixed version of Flexbox. I didn't know this thing. Let's copy this thing. Let's make a note. We'll apply the last value in the array supported by the browser. Okay, well, let's take a break now and then we'll go into conditional rendering.